what was your take in terms of like the vaccine in relationship to like all the potential side effect stuff?
I mean, where to start? One of the things that I think was tough with COVID was the best information we had did change over time. The vaccines were really good at preventing transmission and infection. Over time, they really became less good at that.
What about this whole idea of like the documents? Trump had some top secret documents. Biden also had some documents.
But there seems to be like a deliberate effort to what Trump did that these other guys did not do.
You hate Trump, don't you?
Well, I just think he's a joke.
I want you to say one bad thing that Biden's done, and I want you to say one good thing that Trump did.
Okay.
All right, guys, bang, bang. I thought a great place to start a conversation would be, what is the role of government with the private sector? There's a lot of people on certain sides of the aisle who think that the government should stay the hell out of private business. There's another entire segment of the population who's like, no, actually the government's super important and we should be embracing them and using all of their resources to help businesses, and everyone in between. Like, how do you think about the role of government with private businesses?
So I think it's very easy to assume that someone who's on the political left like me would say regulate everything all the time, more regulation. My view is I'm glad and think regulation is necessary if it can be demonstrated that there is a benefit to it and that an absence of regulation is going to be a problem. So for example, there was this story about this sugar plant where there was a horrible accident where something broke essentially, and somebody was killed. And it immediately started this debate about, well, regulation didn't prevent that, or was there not enough regulation? In that particular case, there was regulation which was not being followed. OSHA was not inspecting regularly enough to determine whether the regulations that were law were actually in place. And so it was basically regulation was there, wasn't enforced. So it wasn't despite regulations, it's we haven't actually given the regulators in this particular case enough power to do what they have to do. So my view is, I don't want to get in the way of business. I'm a business owner. You're a business owner. Unless there's a really good reason to say we need regulation here, I don't want it. I'm not looking just to over-regulate. Mm-hmm. There are many industries where it makes sense to say, you have all the freedom in the world as an entrepreneur to work in this space and make as much money as you want, but we've determined there are some minimum ground rules you have to abide by. And this applies in insurance, it applies in manufacturing, there's some aviation, et cetera. I'm fine with regulation. I think it's critical to have the right amount of regulation, but I'm not interested in over-regulating or saying involve government in everything.
Yeah, what's interesting about this perspective is that there are many businesses where we benefit from regulation in the sense of, I don't know, take the airlines. Like I get on a plane in America and I don't feel like the plane has a 50-50 shot of making it, right? And some of that is a belief in technology and confidence there, the training of the pilot, the safety precautions, the FAA and kind of all the weather and their ability to coordinate between different planes. Like there's a bunch of different layers to this. At the same time, it feels like areas of regulation that people agree on are then extrapolated out and it becomes like, let's regulate a whole bunch of other things. And you can't blanket statement it, right? It's very much industry specific,
yes.
Situation specific. Is there examples where you think that regulation exists, but it's actually at the detriment of a business?
Yeah, let's see. I'm trying to think of the industries in which that would be the case. I think there's lots of situations in the content space, and this is less about regulation by law, but it's more by policy, where, for example, there was a long period of time where the default was in a copyright dispute, the person claiming the copyright infringement was immediately given the benefit of the doubt and the content was taken down. So, for example, me as a content creator, if some company alleged that I violated their copyright, I immediately suffered as a result. I was either restricted on YouTube or had a problem on podcast or would get a demand letter, whatever the case may be, rather than they should really have to prove that I'm actually doing something wrong. The default should actually be the claimant should have to demonstrate that I've done something wrong before I'm sanctioned in some way. That's like an example of where the balance was probably a little bit off.
But this is a great example, right? Because we deal with this all the time on YouTube specifically. And one, there's many cases where we see the copyright claims and we're like, well, we are using a library that is approved, or when it's like for music, or it may even be something that we created that somehow somebody is trying to copyright,
Correct.
Right? And so you go through these situations and you do wonder, like, what is the letter of the law? I think is one. But two, does the letter of the law actually matter when the platform is willing to enforce based on their own rules. And so I do think about this like idea of like hard regulation and soft regulation. So hard regulation being like, these are the letter of the law. There has been a process that has created these laws. They are enforced by a court. But if all of a sudden a platform says like, yeah, we know what the law is, but like we're going to have these other rules, they'll always default to terms of service or whatever. But if it becomes a tool to be weaponized against other users of the platform,
yes,
then all of a sudden, like, what is the point here? Like, how does a platform decide which users to reward and which users to punish with their own set of like kind of fake rules, right?
That's one question. And this was a really big deal during the 2020 debates, the primary. Okay. So the presidential debates are sort of like open source. They're put on by the Commission on Presidential Debates. It's one feed and anybody who wants to can repeat it. The primary debates were really like for-profit endeavors where like CNN would have the copyright to a particular Democratic debate, and then Fox would have the copyright to a different debate. And content creators like me and others were live streaming those events, and CNN on a particular day sort of blanket copyright struck, as the term would be, everybody who was streaming the content, even if it really did meet fair use guidelines. You know, the 4 fair use tests, including you're transforming the content, you're not just repeating it, but you're actually adding something, it's of news or educational value. All those guidelines were met, but there was this sort of like blanket shut everybody down, and we were all shut down in the moment of that night. And then it took weeks to unravel the entire thing.
And the damage was already done.
The damage was already done. And that's the problem with a lot of these things, that as the smaller creator myself, compared to someone like CNN, they have the bully pulpit, they have the direct system to shut us down. I now am in a position where I lost whatever I was going to get from the event, and I have to spend a couple weeks trying to clear my name. Sometimes some people even have to go so far as to hire a lawyer and incur those expenses. It seems extraordinarily unbalanced.
I have had a number of videos taken down over the years. Some of them we've gotten clarity and they've said, hey, look, these are the timestamps. This is what they said. It violates this policy, whatever. We may disagree with the policy, but like, okay, fine. You have your rules. That's fine. Then we have situations where a video is taken down and we get nothing, right? And we have a contact at YouTube. We talk to them. They're like, I don't know what to do. Talk to this other person. Like, you just get like lost in the sauce kind of. But what we've noticed is it drastically increases the odds that we would self-censor ourselves. In terms of, you just beat your head against the wall so many times that you're like, I don't want to deal with arguing over another video getting taken down, potential ramifications, like all these different things. And so if you know that that's happening, you try to fight it, right? Like as much as you can, but you're human and you kind of fall to these biases. And then I saw like the Twitter files. And when I saw that come out, there was things about like all kinds of tags that they supposedly had on accounts that were almost impossible to get off. You then start to get into this world where like, if we're worried about the government going to a social media platform and having some sort of say in the moderation of content, well, like if CNN or another media company could do the same exact thing, which is worse? Is it the government or is it the large media company being able to do it?
That's
an
interesting question.
Doing it?
If I mean, we could talk about the Twitter files. I largely thought substantively the Twitter files were a nothing burger relative to the story that was being told, in the sense that, yes, the Biden campaign, which was not the government at the time, did have the ability to directly email Twitter and say, hey, we want this stuff taken down if it violates the terms of service. The Trump administration had those exact same contacts. I thought that was more or less a nothing burger. I thought the more interesting part about that was more or less what I think you're pointing out, which is, in a sense, this is happening in way more ways than on Twitter. Twitter has terms of service and they have latitude to enforce them more or less the way they want, assuming they're not breaking any law, right? Saying we don't allow Jewish people to tweet. That would violate very specific law, right? But the very interesting part is the way in which this feeds back in other areas and the way content creators like us are affected on YouTube or on Twitch, where it starts to become a self-censorship thing. A really good example of this was in the aftermath. I call them the Trump riots. I don't know, in your audience, you might call them something different. The thing that happened on January 6th, there was a period where footage, if you included any footage of that event, the content was either marked as for mature audiences only, or it was not monetizable on YouTube, or you could actually get suspended on Twitch altogether for those images. It was such a newsworthy story, but we all had to figure out, how do we talk about this and not end up hurting ourselves by getting ourselves banned or whatever the case may be. That seems like a fail of the terms of service, in the sense that it's encouraging us to say, we'll talk about non-newsworthy stuff, because if we talk about this thing in the news, we're going to have a problem.
Well, And like that specific event obviously is like super controversial politically, and like all these different things, different sides of the aisles have different opinions.
Yeah.
But I think when you look at that framework and the ability of them to be able to do that, then what it leads you to start to ask, like, what other situations are we not aware of where this is happening? And one of the pieces I think that just kind of blew my mind, frankly, is there's a specific video I'm thinking of where I interviewed someone. He's a professor at a university. There was one part of the interview I knew they're going to have a problem with. So we, rather than just normally cut it out and have the interview play, we essentially created a snippet or like a clip where I walk onto the screen and we say, hey guys, right now, this guest, Dave, is still talking. I can't put it up. They're going to take the video down. I want you to know that we are being forced to self-censor because of these rules that we've been made aware of and what they want us to say and not say. So you know that there's a piece of the interview that is not being put up here, but I want you to know that rather than me just cut it out and you think that nothing happened, right?
That's interesting.
Okay, back to the show, right? And kind of come back to where now he is past the point of what he said. The video goes up, and we'd interviewed him once before. Hundreds of thousands of views on the interview, probably one of the more popular guests that we've had. This one starts to follow the same trajectory. All of a sudden, after like a week, you ever seen a video grow, and then it literally looks like a horizontal line?
I have, because I work in news and politics where the first 48 hours are key.
It's
so
really
a lot of my
matter.
videos look that way, but I understand that in your space, it's not that typical.
And so like this goes to, it could be a change in consumer behavior. It could be our audience cares and nobody else cares, right? There's all these things that could happen.
Yes.
But I think that idea where people say, okay, hold on a second, this is a spicier interview than, let's say, if we were just talking about Fed interest rate policy or something.
Right.
And it looks weird. And then what happens is we have been doing this a long time, right? So we're kind of just like, hey, it is what it is. Let's move on to the next thing. But there will be people who run out onto Twitter or email or whatever, and they're like, I'm being censored. This is happening, blah, blah, whatever. And so when I see those now, I always have to ask myself, like, are they actually being censored, or is it some weird, algorithmic thing or whatever? And it used to be that I would default my answer to like, probably not. Like, it's probably something that they don't understand, or they just haven't gotten the information yet and they'll change their mind. Now I don't know. Now it leads me to be a little bit more like it's 50-50 whether there's actual like intentionality behind it from the platforms, or it's just like some weird, glitch in the system.
I totally sympathize with what you're saying. I think one of the difficulties anytime people have this conversation, what sometimes happens is it becomes censorship in the idea of someone, a person with a political bias sitting there going, deprioritize this video, prioritize this video. I've seen no evidence that exists. And I've had my battles with, just recently we had a problem with where on January 9th, our YouTube views went down 70%. Algorithmic thing, I don't imagine there is someone there pressing a switch. I think there is something algorithmic, which may be reflective of a bias for sure. I think one of the really tough things with this in general is that when you talk about censorship, I don't have a problem with a platform having terms of service, so we know what the ground rules are, and then enforce them in accordance with what they are. The real problem I have is when I understand the ground rules and I play by them, but due to some either kind of misunderstanding, deliberate or accidental, or confusion or whatever, I am limited anyway. A really great example of this was at one point in the pandemic when I think it was YouTube, maybe it was Twitter, had a rule against COVID disinformation. I might do a video debunking like the guy who says inject your own urine to prevent COVID. I think it's a bad idea to inject your own urine. I've talked to doctors. The doctors were like, don't inject your own urine.
Were people saying
don't
that?
drink your urine. Don't do any of that stuff. There was a guy who said, I'm curing my urine and then using it. I'm gargling with, he was doing all sorts of stuff. Me as someone saying the scientists don't do that. I got caught up in the censorship that was designed to target those spreading the urine disinformation. That's an example of where I understood the terms of service. I was abiding by them. I was debunking the misinformation, but I still got caught up in it. And I don't know what the solution to that is. Maybe it is human reviewers, but sometimes the human reviewers don't speak English as a native language. So can they tell the difference between I'm saying drink your urine or I'm saying don't drink your urine? You understand the difference, but I don't know whether reviewers necessarily do.
The idea of censorship, is there like a line to where, okay, this isn't censorship and now it is? And I'll give you an example. So let's say that YouTube sees a video with a certain topic and they say, we're going to suppress the distribution of it, but it's still allowed to stay up on the site.
Yep.
Is that censorship? Is it not censorship? Like, how do you think about, the word censorship is used all the time, but what actually is censorship versus if they're just suppressing the distribution, is that not actually censorship? Like, how do you think about it?
It depends who you ask. There are people who believed that Twitter not allowing nude pictures of Hunter Biden was censorship. At the same time, it's in their terms of service that nude explicit images of someone released without their consent aren't allowed on the platform. It's pretty clear. It's also illegal in most states. They call it revenge porn, even though a lot of people say that that's not the right term. So that's an example where there were people who thought that was censorship. I didn't seem to think that it was censorship. I think there's a couple components to keep in mind to figure out, is it censorship? Number one, are these ideas, and this is so subjective and I get that, are they ideas that can contribute to their spread would be detrimental to the health or safety of individuals, right? Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about doxing, when we're talking about people saying drink urine, all this different stuff, you can make a really good case that if that became widespread and people maybe falsely believed that there was some authority to it and they followed whatever was being said, that could actually hurt people. I think that's one good question to ask. It's in the eyes to some degree of the beholder, right? And that's the difficulty of it. Number two, I think the arbitrary application of terms of service arguably is a form of censorship, in the sense of, if we have the terms of service and they're understood, some people have to abide by them and some don't. I think that that's a real problem. The difficulty with that second thing is, it is true that if someone with 5 million subscribers on YouTube publishes some piece of disinformation and someone with 500 does it, the person with the 500 might not actually have any problem. But in a way, it's like nobody's really watching that video because they have 500 subscribers. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's inevitable that you're never going to have 100% equitable application. And we kind of have to deal with that. But those are the two things I would look at.
So let's take them in reverse.
Yeah.
I think that there is a size of audience. It's kind of like in the finance world. If you have no money and you have no loans,
right,
bank and other people don't really give a shit. If you have loans, and let's say that it is a normal amount of loans, right? And something goes wrong, the bank is in the upper hand. They have the upper hand, right? And so like you owe the money to the bank, or the bank can kind of call the loan or whatever. But if you have such big loans that the bank is dependent on you,
yes,
all of a sudden you're too big to like fail for the bank, right?
Yes.
And they'll make all sorts of concessions and all this kind of stuff. So we know that goes on in the finance world. Like there's all these jokes of like, have enough of leverage and like then it's the bank's problem,
yes,
right? Same thing in the content world. So if you have the 500 subscribers, like nobody cares, nobody's paying attention, whatever. There's probably all kinds of crazy stuff that happens there. If you have 5 million or less subscribers, let's call it, people are paying attention. And the platform has a lot of control. The platform will really implement things.
Yes.
But if you're a major media company, I don't think YouTube is applying the same rules to you. I actually think that the major media companies on both sides, get somewhat of a pass from these platforms sometimes, because what will happen is either one, they have a massive platform outside of YouTube that they can use to spread the word and fight back and do all this kind of stuff. But also two, it is in the eyes of the platform seen as like they're a news organization. So if they show the video or the photo or whatever that you or I can't do,
yeah,
it's like, these are not news people, right? Even if you're doing news, even if you would consider yourself a news show or whatever. But if you're CNN or Fox or MSNBC or whatever, they just get a little bit more leeway.
There's two parts to that. One is, I do think that that's true. And YouTube CEO Susan Wojcicki, I don't remember if it was a couple years ago, talked about YouTube wants to prioritize what they consider authoritative news sources versus those that they don't. So to some degree, I think that's absolutely true.
And they're openly saying it.
And Susan Wojcicki openly said it, even though in later conversations, it's been sort of like more ambiguous, but she did say it. She did make that clear.
Is that a good thing?
I think that the intention is good. I think the application of it fairly is extraordinarily difficult and problematic.
Okay,
so that's one thing. The other part of it is, I don't know if this is still the case, but there was one time where I remember going to my YouTube rep and I said, listen, I'm doing content. I don't remember what it was. I'm doing content on X and it's getting completely demonetized. Jimmy Kimmel's doing content on the same thing and there's ads running on the videos. And what I was told at the time was, Jimmy's YouTube channel is selling ads differently. It's not coming from the auction AdSense marketplace. So they are selling ads directly to advertisers that appear on YouTube, where the advertisers are saying, we'll run ads no matter what he talks about. So is that relieving or is that concerning? It depends on your perspective, but there was certainly a difference there in how that ad marketplace was playing out.
And it also goes to this idea of when I was talking earlier about, the view counts are going up and then it kind of just goes sideways.
Yeah.
They continue to tell us that if a video is limited monetization or completely demonetized, it has no impact whatsoever on the distribution on the platform.
Yeah.
I'm not a mathematician. I am not a scientist. But when I look at graphs, that appears not to be true.
That is my instinct as well. And we're talking completely, we're these are not hypothetical, but we're speculating here.
Yes.
But it's been my intuition after doing this for so long. When you do this for so long, when I look at my stats and my graphs, things that don't look right attract your eye very much.
Correct.
It's sort of like my dermatologist will often say, if you're paying attention to a particular mole, I'm going to pay attention too, because you know yourself, but you kind of see what things look like. It's the same thing with the YouTube analytics, where you see something weird, your eye is drawn to it. I am on your side that it seems as though that's not true, that it has no impact on the video.
And it would make sense for it to have an impact. Like, I actually wouldn't necessarily have a problem if we were just told, like, okay, YouTube monetization is directly tied to the ability for YouTube to make money.
Yes.
And so if you're making money and YouTube is making money, you're kind of partners on the content.
Yeah.
And so they're going to send that shit, right? If people are going to watch and they're going to make money.
It wouldn't be illogical.
Yeah.
I would just rather know.
Makes complete sense.
Yeah.
By the way, if we turn the monetization off on a video, we make no money from it. And so therefore we're going to put videos where we make money on it out to the audience. Okay, it makes sense. Like, actually, that would be a capitalistic approach to running a business and doing all this. What's weird is that they say that it doesn't have an impact.
Right.
Because it's like, well, okay, the video was growing a lot, then the monetization got shut off, and now it doesn't grow.
Yes.
Right? Like, how is it that it did 100,000 views in 4 days, and then in the 5th day it did 50 views?
Yeah.
Right? And the only thing that changed is we got an email that says monetization got shut off.
It's very hard to believe. And I think those things reduce trust. I have lots of friends who are also YouTubers. And whenever these sorts of things happen, where there's a topic that is all of a sudden not monetizable, after the Roe v. Wade decision, there was a period where if you talked about, it's a Supreme Court decision, it's like substantive stuff, right? Because it dealt with abortion was sort of a hot button issue that was under, I don't remember if it was like the controversial and whatever policy, but it was part of that. Nothing related to the Roe v. Wade decision was monetizable. We all are talking to each other saying, how can we talk about this without suffering because of what is taking place? And then things change and all of a sudden the content is monetizable. You don't necessarily hear anything. This happened at the beginning of the pandemic where it seemed like maybe it's a 2-week story rather than a 4-year story. In December of 2019, when I did a couple of COVID stories, they were just flat out not monetizable. And at the time, I was told by our YouTube rep, that, it deals with medical and tragedy and I don't know, whatever the thing was, it's just not monetizable. By January or February, where it was like, this is going to be every day for the next 2 years, YouTube changed its policy and all of a sudden it was monetizable. As long as I know what the policy is, I can work with it.
Yeah. And I always wonder, like, did they change the policy because of some expert they talked to, or because they realized, like, we're going to have to make money off this?
I don't know.
Yeah. And also, what is the process? How do things get selected for they're good, they're not good?
Right.
Again, we may never know. Going back to your commentary about like the health stuff, one of the things also that surprised me is the country of El Salvador, which is coming to the spotlight because of all the Bitcoin stuff. But they ran an ad early on, which was basically like, get outside, be healthy, eat healthy. Like, I mean, like pretty basic like health stuff.
Yeah.
But it was done in almost like a controversial way because at the time everyone was talking about, potential for vaccines and, all of the various precautions, like all this stuff. And they were like, hey, people who are unhealthy seem to be being affected by this, like, go be healthy, right? And I remember tweeting it and being like, why are other countries not talking about this or doing this or whatever? And I had a friend who messaged me and he was like, dude, forget other countries. Like, I can't go on and say that on YouTube. And I remember being like, what? And so I went and I looked and like nobody was talking about it. And so I reached out to a couple people and they were like, yeah, like that's considered not necessarily misinformation, but it's like not directly in line with what is coming out of the CDC or whatever. And so it was fascinating because like technically the information is not inaccurate, right? They go outside, work out, whatever. Second is like, any other point in time, like you would be allowed to say that and no one would even think about it, right? But like this period of time, this commentary compared to what other people are saying, maybe it's not so good.
Yeah.
And so like then I was like, oh shit, like point in time matters, not only what the content is, but like when are you saying it and under what context,
100%.
Which makes the job even, more complex and harder for them.
Yeah, I was saying more or less that stuff and didn't have an issue with that on YouTube. But also, again, it's who's saying it, what's the size of their channel, what's the context, what's the totality of their coverage. I don't know. I think the COVID thing was also tough because, and my audience knows my view on all this stuff, but one of the things that I think was tough with COVID was the best information we had did change over time. There was a point in time where when the vaccines were for that initial, what they called the live type virus, the vaccines were really good at preventing transmission and infection. Over time, they really became less good at that to the point where now it's like, well, they'll reduce your risk of death and to some degree your risk of hospitalization. On transmission and infection, they're no longer doing anything. It's not that it was a lie back then or that it was mis or disinformation. It's the circumstances genuinely did change and the effectiveness of the vaccine for that piece changed over time. That's also really difficult for people who are trying to at all points accurately cover what's going on.
Yeah. What was your take in terms of like the vaccine in relationship to like all the potential side effect stuff, right? And side effects being I've seen everything from like the hysteria and like what I'll call like the conspiracy theory stuff to like people who are just, hey, I want to put as little things in my body as possible, but I want to be a healthy individual. Like what's your take in terms of like where is probably like more truth than not? Hey guys, what's going on? I hope that you're enjoying this conversation, but I wanted to interrupt for a quick second and tell you about a brand new conference that I'm hosting on March 4th at the Miami Beach Convention Center. The event is called LYCEUM Miami, and tickets are completely free for anyone who wants to come. I'm bringing together many of the most popular guests from the podcast over the last couple of years. Some of the guest speakers that we've already announced are people like Vivek Ramaswamy from Strive Asset Management, or Delian and Mike Solana from Founders Fund, Chris Williamson from the Modern Wisdom podcast, Cody Sanchez from Contrarian Thinking, and billionaire Christian Augermeyer, among many others. I've got a number of amazing surprise guests as well, some that you definitely will not expect, and others that come from walks of life that you will be scratching your head as to how I even got them to show up. But come check out LYCEUM Miami on March 4th. The LYCEUM was a public gym in Athens, Greece, where people used to come together, talk about ideas, and debate topics that were important to society. I want to meet people in person, in real life, once again, after 3 years of a hiatus from real life events. And so I'm hosting the event. And as I mentioned, anyone from anywhere can come to this event completely for free. All you need to do is go to lyceummiami.com and you'll be able to pick up a free general admission ticket. Make sure you claim your ticket in order to get in through the doors. LYCEUM Miami is going to be a great time. So come check it out. Come hang out with me, many of the popular guests from the podcast, and other like-minded individuals. LYCEUM Miami, March 4th, Miami Beach Convention Center. I hope to see you there. All right, let's get back into this conversation.
Well, more truth than not. This is a big topic. I mean, where to start? So first of all, I think a lot of the hysteria stuff, we can maybe chop out that and that'll get rid of like 70% of the stuff.
And would you put like the thing I'm speaking or thinking of specifically is like the
myocarditis, pericarditis. Okay. So
you sound like a doctor, not me.
The best information I've seen, and again, I don't come up with my opinions on this stuff because I'm not a doctor. I'm trying to go to the peer-reviewed science on this. The best information I've seen is the risks of myocarditis and pericarditis from the vaccine are lower than from COVID on average.
Interesting. So it's not only just like low or high, but in comparison to other things.
Yeah. Exactly. And if I understand correctly, even when it does happen and it seems to be concentrated more in younger males, that's a side effect, even though it's still extraordinarily rare. It usually resolves by itself with no intervention within a few days. So it's also not particularly serious. I understand it's uncomfortable, but it's not particularly serious. And my take on it, as I got my vaccines, and I'm in that age group, my take on it was I'd rather take a shot on less severe COVID than on an extraordinarily rare side effect. And so like we all got COVID 2 months ago, my girlfriend and my baby daughter. I was like really not feeling well for about 28 hours. I can't say what it would have been like with no vaccines, but it's sort of, it compared to the stories other people tell of 4, 5, 6, 7 days really not doing well. After 28 hours, I was almost back to normal. Totally plausible it was the vaccine. I don't know. I mean, that's kind of where I fall on it, I think. On the other side of requirements or any of that stuff, I am not the type of person who's going around saying mandate these vaccines. I do think there's a total perfect legal basis for schools to include this vaccine in a list of others that are required, or college. There's nothing really special or unique about that. Vaccine requirements go back over 100 years. And to me, that seemed kind of like a distraction from just like what makes sense to do from a health perspective.
So the mandates is interesting, right? Because in New York City, for example, they locked down basically the city, and you couldn't go to a restaurant without having the vaccine card and all this stuff for a period of time.
Indoors, right? Outdoors, you could do.
Indoors, correct. Yeah. And it was a weird thing where like, you didn't know how long they could keep this going, or like, was it a forever thing, right? Kind of like, what is the most permanent thing? It's like a temporary government program, right? The old saying. Yeah. But what I found most interesting was less about like, what does the government say, and more about like, are the restaurants going to enforce it or not? Which gets back to kind of the regulation conversation. And I always use jaywalking as the example. Like, for those that don't know, jaywalking is illegal. You're not supposed to do it. In New York City, you could jaywalk in front of a cop, and like literally they don't even pay attention.
And jaywalking is just crossing where there's no crosswalk, right?
Correct. Yeah. So like, again, seems like not a big deal. If someone gets hit by a car, then like, then it all of a sudden becomes a big deal. So like, kind of a weird thing, but it's not enforced a lot. Now, of course, you will find a cop every once in a while who like is trying to stop somebody, and they're like, oh, perfect excuse is like
it's
jaywalking.
Used as a pretext.
Correct. You technically broke the law. So like, here we go. Right. And so this was like pretty similar in that like some restaurants were very, very, very serious about it. Right.
Yes.
Others I'll put in the like kind of, we'll do the bare minimum. So like flash me something that kind of sort of looks like it. And like,
whether it's a copy or someone else's or whatever.
But just even just like, it doesn't even have to be an actual card. Like it could just be like your license. I saw a picture and some letters and like, whatever, you're good. And then other restaurants like wouldn't even ask. And we weren't living in New York at the time. So like we were going, and when we were there, it was like kind of interesting. Like, is this restaurant like a serious one, not serious, like whatever. And I just remember thinking to myself, like, this is chaos, right? And then you get outside of this like super urban dense area where like there was actual mandates, and then it got into the like personal preference, where some business owners, even though it might not be legally mandated, were like, this is like what I want to, our policy.
Yeah.
And then it's like, well, is that legal? Is that not legal? How does that work? Like you get into this like very, very weird world very quickly where I was like, oh shit, all the people who were like the economists in early 2020 are now about to become like Supreme Court experts on, like free speech and
the
mandates.
Epidemiologists became constitutional law attorneys. I know. So the legal thing, we would have to talk to a lawyer. I mean, my view was earlier in the pandemic, when the vaccines against that early variant were really good at preventing transmission, I liked the idea of, after feeling shut in for a while, saying, hey, you know what? I can go to a restaurant and know, if the restaurant's doing it, everybody in here has received a vaccine. That means they're not going to give me the virus. I'm not going to give it to them. That's really interesting to me. As the reality started to change in many ways, which is the vaccine became less effective on transmission. So it became more, I can protect myself against hospitalization or death by getting myself vaccinated. So it became more of that. And the death rate went down, and it started shifting into something a little more seasonal. It didn't really make the same sense to me to say you have to be vaccinated to come into the restaurant, because the facts changed, so to speak. On masks, I've always been I will wear one if it's required. I didn't avoid flying when it was required. I'll just wear the mask, and then I'm at the place I'm going to, and it's great. We went to Aruba after getting our vaccines and all this stuff. Great. And then once the masks were no longer required, I said, all right, I'll decide for myself. Do I want to wear one or not? And that was fine. The thing that really stressed me out about seeing the reaction from some was there was a period where there were these handful of things that, based on everything we knew at that time, were really like pretty light lifts. They weren't life-altering things. And the resistance from some people, either because of some law they misunderstood, as you point out, or whatever, their resistance to do it, it kind of just bummed me out, because I would have thought naively maybe that there would have been more of like a coming together and like, hey, let's just all do this stuff for a little while and see if this helps.
Do you think that people resisted it because they were scared, like you give an inch, they take a mile? Like it was less about the individual law or the individual like inconvenience or whatever. And it was more of just like, we can't give the inch because then they will take the mile. And it was like a psychological thing.
100% there were people who were afraid of that. I don't think it was based in reality. You know, when we go back to the gay marriage debate, there were people who were saying, listen, if two dudes can get married, next thing you know, people will be marrying trains and horses. And it's like, well, no, trains and horses can't enter contracts. They can't, that slippery slope is an absurd argument. And similarly, you know, during the early mandate phase, there were people, including I think the people who tried to kidnap the Michigan governor, who were saying, first thing is you got to get a vaccine. Next thing you know, all this, none of that stuff happened. I mean, literally none of those other things happened. It didn't go any further. They were talking about a slippery slope and it just went nowhere.
So I'm laughing because, I was pretty sure there's a book called The Woman Who Married a Horse.
Oh, is it?
Now it's a book. It's not a real thing, but
it's not nonfiction, I'm guessing. It's a novel.
It is a definitely they call it a monograph, which I don't know exactly what that is.
Okay.
But on the Michigan governor thing, you probably paid more attention to me. The feds were involved somehow.
You know, honestly, I don't remember the exact.
Yeah.
I think what. So
this is like a meme on the internet now.
Yeah,
like you see these pictures at like all these protests or whatever,
Yeah.
and they're like they just circle like a random group of like white dudes usually, and they're like feds.
Right.
And
Ray
I'm like,
Epps on January 5th is another one where they were like, this guy's. I don't know if you've heard about Ray Epps. This is another one you could look up where there were people saying Ray Epps. It's just an old dude. He was in D.C. on the 5th. He was encouraging people the next day to go into the Capitol. He's an FBI agent. No, absolutely no evidence of that. This guy's been harassed now from people trying to prove he's like, I have nothing to do with it. My understanding is that someone involved in that kidnapping plot was working as a confidential informant, which some people on Twitter seem to think means you're an FBI agent, but it doesn't. I think that that's the connection. But it's been a couple years, so I don't remember the details of the story.
When you see that type of stuff, like how do you think about the conversation around those topics, right? So like I'll get the details in a second of like what actually happened, but should the platforms be like correcting people when they talk about things? Let's say, for example, you're talking about the difference between a confidential informant or an agent of a law enforcement agency across any topic, any situation. If somebody uses the wrong terminology, should the platform like take them down? Should they
I don't
like
think
correct
for something
them?
like that. I
yeah,
mean,
like how does that work?
You know, Twitter had this policy where, and YouTube as well, where if it detected certain keywords, it would pop up a little info box. So if there was a video about vaccines, no matter what you were saying, there was a period where you would look underneath the video and it would say, here's a link to the CDC where you can get information about vaccines or whatever the case may be. Sometimes I think Twitter will put something in there that says this is like an evolving situation and, you know, what is being put out right now may not actually be accurate or whatever the case may be. I think I applaud those efforts in general. I think that if you go down to the nitty gritty of like, if someone uses the word confidential informant, something pops up and is like, oh, you should know the difference between that and an agent. That seems to be a little too much.
So this is an article from the Chicago Sun-Times. I don't know if they have political leaning or not, but it's one of the first ones that popped up. The headline is FBI's tactics, doomed case against men charged in kidnapping plot of Michigan governor. And the opening paragraph is just through confidential sources, undercover agents, and clandestine recordings. The Justice Department announced in October 2020, law enforcement learned particular individuals were planning to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmire and acting in furtherance of that plan. But that was the end quote. But it turned out that those individuals included the government's confidential sources who pushed the half-baked scheme and orchestrated acts in a furtherance of that plan, even when the defendants resisted it. Which then gets into like this weird world of like,
right. So that's why there was a contingent saying the FBI organized the plot. And it's like, well, no, that's not what that article said. What the article said was there were individuals already working as informants who did try to encourage. And I think the issue was whether it was some form of entrapment. I do think it hurt some elements of the case, but pretty recently, I think that the main plotters actually were given pretty severe prison sentences.
Yeah, so I think there was 4 people at this time. Jurors acquitted 2 alleged conspirators, and they failed to reach verdicts for the other 2. But then there's other articles talking about there were 6 original defendants, 2 of them which pled guilty and testified for the prosecution as well. And then I guess some of the individuals involved were also tried on different things. And so like my general read on all this is like it's messy.
It's
right?
messy. I think the messiest part of it, and as someone who tries to encourage people to, like, when you read a news article, understand, is this a primary source? If it's sometimes you'll see an article that's really just rewriting someone else's work, go to that original article, really try to think critically. When words like may or could be are there, that's very different than something that is happening or that did happen. Sometimes these stories are used as proxies by people cynically for political reasons to make much broader claims that can be made. Like, for example, nobody did anything wrong on January 6th, for example, or the FBI is uniquely a bad actor and should be disbanded, or things like that. That's where this type of stuff gets extraordinarily messy.
When we think of the last, let's call it 5 presidents, right? 4 presidents. We've got George W. Bush, we've got Obama, we've got Trump, and then Joe Biden. So let's go last 4.
Yeah.
What do you think they've done well, and what do you think they haven't done well?
Oh boy. So let's see. I don't think any of them have really done that much for the lower middle class.
Okay.
I think you can find things, with the Bush tax cuts, which went mostly to the very rich. There were those small payments to the average person. So you could say, well, that's something. With Obamacare didn't get everybody health care, but it did get much closer to getting people health care. Medicaid expansion, which instead of hitting just the poorest, it went a little higher than that. So it got more people on Medicaid. With all of these presidents, although I think with Trump, it's harder to find the stuff for the lower middle class and middle class. They didn't really do as much as I would like to see, as someone who thinks that Denmark and Sweden and Norway are more interesting ways to organize an economy. I think it's sort of like degrees. On foreign policy, I think Bush's main mistakes were Afghanistan and Iraq. I think with Obama, the kind of squishiness when it came to Russia wasn't great. The drone program I didn't love. Trump is just so confused about it. I don't know. I mean, he had love letters with Kim Jong-un, and then it's really hard to analyze Trump with only a couple years in the rearview mirror because it was so kind of cartoonish.
Do you think that Trump did a horrible job, a fantastic job, or an okay job?
I think Trump did a terrible job.
Terrible job. Okay.
Here's the thing. There were a lot of things Trump wanted to do but failed to do. And that was great because they would have been horrible, right? So in that sense, like if Trump had gotten to do his agenda, the healthcare plan, one of the things Trump ran on was, we're going to get rid of Obamacare and we'll replace it with a beautiful system. They never really proposed it. The one thing that was proposed in 2017 by Republicans in consultation would have led to like 25 million more people losing health insurance. But it didn't happen. So that's great. It was a terrible idea, but it failed. So we can kind of, do we zero it out? Maybe so. Trump was going to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the first year. Jared was going to solve it. You might not be shocked to hear it didn't actually happen. He moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which was, this is internal politics, but it was controversial. It irritated a lot of people, et cetera.
Why was that so controversial?
Well, the reason it's controversial is within Israel, particularly among the more Orthodox Jews and also among the evangelical American community, for religious reasons, they want the capital of Israel to be Jerusalem. Right now, politically, Jerusalem is disputed. So internationally, the capital of Israel is Tel Aviv. The people who want to just push the embassy to Jerusalem, it doesn't change the capital, but it's a signal. It's sort of like saying, we view Jerusalem as the capital because that's where we're putting the embassy. It sends a signal of like, we don't actually care to resolve the conflict around Jerusalem. We're just going to put the embassy there anyway. So it inflames. It doesn't work towards peace. It arguably works against it.
Yeah.
So that's something he did. It didn't get us closer to peace. So I think the thing on Trump is very confused. confused about North Korea, confused about China, didn't understand how tariffs worked, all these things. But fortunately, he didn't actually accomplish a lot of the things he tried to do. And I think we're better off for it. That's my political perspective.
You think he didn't do a good job with North Korea?
Well, what did he do, I guess, is the question.
Yeah. Well, he kept them from doing anything, right? But also, I guess the question would be, did he do that, or were they not going to do anything anyways?
Yeah, I mean, if you understand the last 50 years with North Korea, it's a very similar cycle, which is they start to make belligerent comments and they start doing missile tests and they appear to get marginally closer to developing whatever the next step in technology would be. Often it coincides with when there's famine or horrible circumstances. They then walk it back a little bit in consultation with, negotiating partners in exchange for food aid, and the whole thing kind of circles. And so the funny thing about Trump was, it was just kind of like a naivete where Kim Jong-un told Trump all the same stuff every North Korean leader has been telling every American leader for a very long time. And Trump thought that it was an accomplishment because he just didn't understand the history. And it's like, these leaders have been making these exact same promises forever. They never actually do them. They never demilitarize. They never do any of these things. Because Trump didn't know the history, he thought it was a major deal.
What do you think is the best thing he did?
I think that this is really narrow and it might have been repealed, but in that tax plan that he did in 2017, he lowered the threshold at which point medical expenses become tax deductible. That's a good thing because there's people who have high medical expenses for their income, but not quite enough for them to be tax deductible. I think it's a really good thing, especially when a lot of people pay for their own healthcare, to make it easier to make medical expenses tax deductible. Part of me thinks that might have actually been reversed, which would be really sad because I thought that was a good thing. I think the First Step Act, the criminal justice reform, did some good things.
What was that?
And so it changed sentencing around cannabis to a great degree, and it also did some, I don't remember if it was expungement or it helped people who had been previously wrapped up in the justice system as a result of cannabis. I think that was good. I think it would have been great for him to do more of that. The funny thing is, and this goes to Trump's confusion about everything, since leaving office, he goes around saying we should execute drug dealers. He is the one who, through the First Step Act, actually allowed some of those drug dealers to have their records cleared or whatever. It's like, do you remember that you did that? So it's all like a mishmash, throwing stuff at the wall. But I do think that was a good thing that he did.
Is he the most entertaining president of all time?
100%.
Right?
100%.
I think that is one of the things that the media definitely misses, is just like, you woke up every day, and you didn't know what was going to happen,
right,
which was like chaotic.
Yes.
But also, I gotta say that when he tweeted "Little Rocket Man" at Kim Jong-un, pretty funny.
I would even
scary, but pretty funny.
So there's two parts to this. It is scary. It is scary because you realize the president didn't like where the hurricane was really going, so he took a Sharpie and he drew a different hurricane map. It's horrifying, but it's incredibly funny. It's incredibly funny. I told the story on another podcast, Trump's obsession with toilets. You can't even do a skit. I don't know if you remember this.
What is his obsession with
this?
Toilets?
Was all about how Biden was going to end heating and cooling. He was going to give you low flow shower heads, and also the toilets were going to be low flow, so you'd have to flush them 10 to 15 times. Okay, so he kept saying at rallies, you're going to have to flush toilets 10 to 15 times. It's not going to work.
Which, by the way, if that was true, that would suck.
It would be terrible, right? But it wasn't
fun.
happening. You should see the toilets I was able to get installed at my place. So he starts talking about that. Then it turns on, after he loses, he goes on Fox News and he goes, there were huge dumps, and you're like, what is on this guy's mind? He's obsessed with toilets. He's talking about huge dumps of votes in the middle of the night. And then you find out he was flushing documents down the toilet. And you're like, that's why he needed to flush 10 to 15 times, because he's jamming classified documents. You can't write stuff like this. And it takes this 6-month arc to figure it out. It's pure comedy. It really is, but scary.
So is there something to the fact that Trump, Boris Johnson, Zelensky, et cetera, were all elected and kind of different than the mold of leaders of these countries, and they all kind of rose up in power at the same time?
Yeah, I think they are different things. I think Trump is more analogous to like an Erdogan in Turkey, Bolsonaro. He's more of an authoritarian type guy. Boris Johnson is a little bit like that. And then Zelensky is kind of a different type of figure. The circumstances are very different in all of those countries. I think the more interesting trend in terms of who's been getting elected has been this kind of authoritarian slide in the United States among some Republicans, which is being mirrored in parts of Europe as well. In France, with Marine Le Pen doing well but not ultimately winning, and Orban, Boris Johnson to some degree. There are other examples. There are people who I don't say that they're wrong in the feeling that they have sort of been left behind for different reasons. Some think they've been left behind because dark-skinned immigrants have come in. I don't agree with that, but some of them feel that. Others think it's because of business not being regulated, whatever the case may be. And they've all kind of said, we need someone like a Trump or Orban or Johnson. So that's been the trend that I've seen. It's concerning to me because I don't think that we would be better off with those types of leaders. Others would have a different opinion, I'm sure.
Yeah, this is like a really fascinating topic because I think that the left, I'm putting that in air quotes for those that are just listening because I don't even know what that really means at this point, controls the media, would be like the critique of the media, right, by the right. And then vice versa is like, I think a lot of people on the left would critique the right and be like, no, but you guys are like the crazy, alt-right on social media and like all this kind of stuff. So it's like a very weird, people just like to yell and scream back and forth at each other. But when you go to the state level, it seems like most of the more aggressive policies actually were happening in the Democratic states or the Democrat states versus the Republican states. Now, I'm just using California, New York, Texas, Florida as like kind of a line that you could draw.
Do you mean on COVID or on what?
I think COVID's one, but there's other things like we're obviously seeing around school education, like you can kind of go through all the political topics that are like the hot topics. And I think that there's two very different approaches, right? And when you see those policies, one is very much like more free market, like, hey, people should just like do whatever they want to do, which comes with pros or cons, but like that is the approach. The other side is much more like, this is the policy, top down, hey, this is what we should be doing. Is that true elsewhere in the country that we see kind of this divide on red and blue states? Or is it just that like New York, California, and Florida, Texas have always been at the extremes of some of this, and so they tend to get all the attention?
I don't even think it's true in the states you mentioned.
Oh,
and I'll give you a counterexample. So in Texas has a very powerful board of education because since it's such a large population state, they can have a huge impact on the books that are used. And then that can trickle down to other states because it's just so powerful if you can get books that are being used in Texas. In Texas, there are all sorts of places, and I don't remember them, but we could look them up, where they are wanting to teach intelligent design or creationism alongside evolution in science class. That's quite aggressive, I would say, because you're
explain the difference for people who don't know.
Well, evolution is the theory of evolution and the way in which humans and the great apes evolved from a common ancestor who evolved from some earlier,
which people would say is like generally the science. Yes, exactly. The science approach.
We could call it the scientific approach, yeah.
Science now is controversy as well.
And then you have intelligent design and creationism, which is a religious view from only some religions, right? Because there's 1,000 religions, it's only some religions. And to teach that, which is really more suited for Sunday school, I think is what they call it, rather than science class, that to me doesn't seem like freedom and liberty. It seems like a red state saying, here is what you will teach. So I think that narrative, which is not a rare narrative, like it's not unreasonable for you to frame it that way as someone who is more in the finance space than the political space.
Yeah, I don't know anything about politics.
I totally get.
I'm getting a crash course.
Yeah, no, I totally get. Now, you could get someone else sitting here who would say, Anthony, you're absolutely right with that. You're spot on. I happen to disagree with that take. But I think that it's much more complicated than that, really. And a lot of times the idea of the red states of freedom and do whatever you want, it only extends so far. The Attorney General of Texas recently said he thought he could defend sodomy laws in court. Sodomy laws are laws where the law says what kind of sex you can have behind closed doors. That's not freedom and liberty. That's very aggressive. We're going to sort of tell you what to do. So I think that generalization doesn't really hold.
Yeah. What about this whole idea of like the documents? So obviously there's a bunch of hoopla around Trump had some top secret documents or whatever, and now it's coming out that Biden also had some documents. I think Mike Pence has documents.
Yes.
It seems like anyone who's been in the White House and like in the last like 5 years got documents somewhere. First, like, is that a normal thing? Has this been going on forever?
It seems normal. That's the thing. We're sort of learning that it's not that rare. I think that here's the problem, and this is where, again, if you superficially look at the stories, like many of the people who email me do, you get one impression. If you look more deeply, you see that there are some categories here. One issue is there overclassification in general? Like, does the US just classify too many things where some of the things that were kept by these people shouldn't actually have been classified? Fair question. They were classified, so let's put that aside for a moment. With Pence and with Biden, and this is a Republican and a Democrat, everything that I've seen so far suggests that they genuinely had no idea that these documents were left behind. They didn't tell anyone, box these up and put them at my house. As soon as they were found, they were immediately turned over to the National Archives, and they are cooperating with investigations. So the Pence and Biden thing, to me, seem relatively benign. The Trump one seems different in that it's hundreds rather than a couple dozen documents. There's testimony that Trump directed people working for him, box these up and take them to Mar-a-Lago. When they were found, rather than saying, turn everything over right away, he used lawyers to try to keep the documents. Even when his lawyers said, here's all the documents, they still kept documents. And then there's video footage of in the middle of when this was going on of the documents being moved from one place to another at Mar-a-Lago. So it seems like there's a couple categories here, but it does seem, I would wonder, are there secretaries of state where some documents were left behind? It wouldn't strike me as super unusual, but there seems to be like a deliberate effort to what Trump did that these other guys did not do.
Can I tell you what my reaction was as I like started to see all this? And again, like coming from somebody who cares less about like the partisan politics.
Yeah.
I was like, man, there's a lot of paper. Like, like in the business world, like I mean, yeah, we still use paper, but like a lot of stuff is digital. And I think I was just blown away by like how many boxes of documents and folders and like it just seemed like such an archaic way of like conducting day-to-day activities.
Yeah.
And I was like, guys, just get a fucking iPad.
But you know what the reason why they don't have the I mean, it's for information security reasons.
Of course.
You know, they put these things in a room, everybody's got to leave their phones, you can look at it, and then that's it.
But it just seemed like that was like literally like my like uneducated elementary view at first was just like, why are there so many physical papers, right? And then you start to understand why they're doing some of this or whatever.
100%.
And it just like kind of blew me away that like, wait, we expect somehow the government to like track down all these physical pieces of paper for years and years. And like, of course people have stuff,
100%.
right? Doesn't make it right. Doesn't whatever.
Yeah.
Or did they do intentionally? Did they not? Whatever. But like, you're telling me only 3 guys got it? Like,
no way.
Obama, sorry, man, but like you probably got some stuff, right? Bush, you probably got some stuff. Like, and it could be like, from what this classification thing, I guess is like, sometimes they just, if they don't know, they just stamp it and like, hey, this is classified as something, but it could be like directions to get to, you know, lunch, right? Or
I don't think that it would be that, but I mean, I think
if you're going to meet a specific person, like, so I was seeing something online, which was like things that you actually don't think are that important, like directions to lunch, could be completely innocent, but if it's involved in a top secret investigation or there's a specific person or whatever, all of a sudden it's part of this like package.
Right.
So it ends up getting in there. Now, I don't think anyone at least has said that they believe these individuals are going through the packets and like taking out the benign information, right? And like, let me leave the important stuff and take this other stuff. It's more of just like, there's a box of documents or there's a folder of documents or whatever. And so really important stuff and really not important stuff are all kind of boxed up together.
Yeah.
But I do wonder, like, what is the line in terms of, let's say that the American people read all of the documents, right? What do you think could be in the documents that people would like, be like, I don't care about politics, like, that's wrong?
It's wrong to have the documents, or what's being done?
What's in the documents is like deemed so bad that somebody took it. So like if the nuclear codes, right, were on the documents, I think people would be like, oh, those are like the actual codes. We probably shouldn't have those floating around. Like, I don't care what side of the aisle you're on. Like, that's bad.
Yep.
Now, as you kind of go down that list of things and get closer and closer to like non-material benign stuff, like where do you think the line is where people would be like, oh, I can't believe that those are just floating around out there.
See, I think it's less about I can't believe that they're floating around, but a lot of these documents relate to ongoing operations. They could expose individuals that are working in areas where they are not known to be working because there's either diplomatic cover or other types of cover. For me, it's less about, oh, Trump had a document he flushed about aliens. It wouldn't be that type of shock, but they would be things that would just interfere with the operations of government, either clandestinely or in terms of diplomatic or foreign policy. It seems to me that the bulk would be that sort of stuff, where the average, to be quite frank, I think the average person looking at some of these documents wouldn't even know why they're interesting, because they wouldn't even follow the substance of what's there. They'd be related to issues they don't know about. But I think it's that they could compromise operations, or it would be that sort of thing.
You think there's aliens?
I have no reason to think we've been in contact with them, but I find the general idea that because of the size of the universe mathematically, it's pretty likely there's intelligent life somewhere. That's compelling to me. I don't think they visited us.
Snowden, I think, was asked when he got inside all the systems or whatever.
Oh, was he?
I'm pretty sure he was asked, and he says he checked and didn't see anything.
Okay.
Like no documentation, at least, of like it. But then you listen to like the Bob Lazard, or I don't know if you've heard any of these guys, and they're like, I saw the saucer.
That stuff is super entertaining. I mean, I think it's fascinating. I don't know if you ever listened to Howard Stern, but he had this guy, Riley Martin, who since passed away.
Who's that?
Who believed that he had been abducted and all these. It's obviously all untrue, but some of the most entertaining stuff.
How do you know it's untrue?
Well, I mean, it doesn't make any sense. You know, none of it makes any sense. But
the Bob Lazard one, I will say, the Bob Lazard one, I listened, I think 2 episodes.
Okay.
And if what he is saying is his experience, right? Because some of it's like, I saw lights, right? The type stuff. But like, let's just say that hold that is true. I got a lot more questions.
Okay.
Right. And then he like worked in Area 51, and or maybe like an area that was tangential, I think, to it. And he's like, I saw like the flying saucer, basically.
Yeah.
Now, again, is that an American-made, kind of defense-based thing? Is that a alien aircraft? Like you get in all these, like there could be other explanations or whatever.
Yeah.
But like, damn, that sounds like a lot more information than we've been told.
Well, one of the things that is interesting in general about the entire aliens thing is that the stories that are told are really similar in the West and in places that have access to Western media, and they mirror a lot of the stuff from movies and television. If you go to places where there's less access to Western media, it's not that you don't have a portion of the population that reports these types of unexplained phenomena, but they don't conform to the saucer and the humanoid alien and anal probes. I don't know why, it's like there's proctologists seem to be aliens, and other planets, it's the one job that you have. It's all very strange. But they have a totally different sort of set of ideas. Mm-hmm. It is interesting that so much of what is in media is what's mirrored by people who claim that these things happen to them. It doesn't seem like a coincidence to me.
Yeah, and I wonder how much of it is like you start to see things that you've heard, right, versus you just make it up, right, which is the other thing. Aliens and UFOs are different.
Yeah.
What do you take out of the government releasing the UFO videos?
Yeah, I have a hard time having a strong opinion one way or the other. I don't think it's evidence of aliens. It seems, from what I've read, it's almost certainly either technology being developed by the US or by other countries. And the videos, the angles make it seem as though things that defy gravity are taking place, if that makes sense. I haven't seen anything where I see it and I say, that's definitely evidence of something from another universe.
That might scare me more if it was like,
arguably,
China is developing this aircraft and we don't know how to replicate that technology, and it's faster and more powerful than anything we have. Like, that might scare me more than fucking aliens.
The geopolitical impact would probably be bigger. I don't know. Yeah.
Like that stuff really, I think people would be like, wait, hold on a second. Forget the aliens thing. That was just going to be cool. I want to grab a beer with one of them, right? Like,
well,
this actually is like a problem.
Vision, which I don't have anymore because people have told me it's really naive. I had this idea that if ever there was like this first contact with aliens, humans would be so inspired by it that the globe would come together, and there would be like a lot of these petty differences about, homophobia and wars and religion would all go away because we would all realize, wow, we're not alone in the universe. I've spoken to so many people, psychologists, social scientists, astronomers, all these people, and they all say, no, it would be like 2 weeks of like, wow, this is incredible. And then everybody would go back to the exact same conflicts that we've had. That's probably true.
Well, and also the question is, are the aliens friendly or adversarial?
Of course.
Right.
Of course.
And, so
and there's a ton of science about or speculation about that.
Yeah.
Some which says by the very fact that they can get here, it would signal that their intentions are, all this stuff's been gone through one way or the other. I think maybe someday we will find out. I don't know.
Yeah. What are the areas when it comes to the politics and the intersection with like the Federal Reserve? Obviously, inflation went bananas, right? Official numbers kind of just under 10%. Unofficial measurements, depending on who you ask, is like 12 to 20% or whatever. The Fed's been stepping in a super aggressive way, crashing asset prices, trying to kill demand on the consumer side. Is there a place for politics when it comes to like monetary policy stuff? Or do you
think there is.
Separate?
I would like it to be less political. I think from a macroeconomic perspective, the tools are pretty well known. They're relatively limited. There are, from the political side, aside from the Fed acting on interest rates, you have sometimes elected officials want to do stimulus, which includes government spending, and there's different opinions about the impact of that on inflation.
Which, by the way, sorry to interrupt you, but that reminds me, Trump, I think that's probably the thing that he did for the lower and middle classes. I just, for whatever reason, have the memes of Trump bucks, right? And people being like, I don't give a shit about anything. Trump sent me money. I'm voting for him,
that's
right?
Absolutely true. But then they were angry when Biden sent the money.
Whole thing, right?
different thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, listen, my view was, as someone who thinks we are terrible at predicting what an economy is going to do, my view at just the arc of the thing was that inflation was going to start coming down 3 or 4 months ago. I said this a year plus ago. It was just a lucky guess, and it sort of has started to happen. And now the question is, did the Fed do too much? Is it going to continue having too much of an impact and it will drag down the stock markets or whatever? I remind myself that the long-term view is probably the most important to me in the thinking of where the country is going and where the economy is going for the average person. And food being really expensive has been a really tough thing for people of average incomes, et cetera. When that is the case, I'm fine with doing targeted stimulus. I'm not about just deficit spend for no reason. Let's actually think about the economic multiplier of the spending that we're doing. But I think that the Fed becomes way more political than it has to be, for sure.
We had Trump, who was tweeting at the central bank, basically, devalue the currency, kind of all the currency games, and he was comparing it to other countries. Biden, on the other hand, I likened it to, he basically called Jerome Powell into the principal's office at one point, right? And it was very like, hey, this isn't politics, but what's going on over there? This kind of was at least the vibe, I think, that kind of came out of a lot of the media articles was like they were unhappy, they wanted to talk to him, whatever. And so I tend to think a lot of the political partisanship is just like a mirror of each other, right? So
and also everyone has to have something to say. When one side enters the political space with something like interest rates, the other side has to respond.
Yeah. Well, and also they do the same things, right? So like, I'll give you a great example. Let's use two individuals. Maybe we'll use a topic as well. So like Trump and AOC are more similar than they are different.
Well, they both use populist rhetoric, which is a very common way now of coalescing people around you. Their policy solutions would be different, but they're using similar rhetoric for sure.
The tactics are similar, right? That the language is similar, the platform distribution is similar. And then the other thing too that I think is really interesting is what I'll call the marketing. So Trump, I don't know, using the hats, let's say, as a ability to raise money and to kind of hammer home his message. AOC wearing the dress that says tax the rich.
Yeah, but she's not selling the dress and then lying about what she's using the money for.
No, but she sells sweatshirts that say tax the rich that are like $65. I only know that.
I didn't know. Where does the money go?
That's a good question. I only know that because Kevin O'Leary has one and he wears it around like to like dinner and stuff.
Okay.
And I was like, what are you doing? And he's like, no, tax around. I'm on board. Yeah, let's do it. So like again, it's just like there's a lot more similarities. And part of it, I think, is just like there's only so many things as a politician, like there's topics to talk about, there's current events, there's like get attention, raise money, and like win the next election.
Yeah.
Like there's not really that much more to do. And so if it almost in some ways is actually a positive if like you're smart enough to see someone on the other side of the aisle doing something that works and you figure out how to do it yourself. And that's kind of like business, right?
As a business of the personal brand and getting themselves reelected, 100%. I think where it becomes a huge distraction is on an issue that really is not super political, like gas prices. I always tell my audience, go back to the beginning of my show. You will find I have never played these political games on gas prices. Presidents have very little impact on gas prices. You've got a global market. You've got your strategic petroleum reserve, which can have a 10 to 18 cent, depending on who you ask, kind of temporary impact. I have never praised Democrats for low gas prices. I have never criticized Republicans for high. I jokingly tweeted, it's amazing how quickly Joe Biden got the gas prices down after getting them up, right? But that is an issue where it's just a total distraction. We're missing talking about real issues by pretending that the presidents are doing things to raise and lower gas prices when it's a global phenomenon and they have almost no impact on it whatsoever.
This plays almost perfectly into this theory that I have about the president specifically. So not government, but the president. They actually can't do as much as most people think they can do, right? If you really think about, take Bush, there's the wars, but other than that, there's not a ton of things that you can point to that
the tax cut.
Well, but were radically different that had this long-lasting negative impact on a large portion of the population. Then you jump to Obama, and there's a lot of people who didn't want Obama to be president. They were yelling and screaming at why he was president and all this stuff. Same as Bush, obviously, right? Obama, he got the Medicare and the healthcare bill through. Obamacare,
Yeah.
right? But there wasn't really anything that had this radical, huge negative impact on the population, right? Then you go and you jump to Trump, same thing, right? Of like, there's a whole bunch of chaos and like much more entertainment factor than anything. But like, when you really look at it, there wasn't anything that was like this huge negative impact on like a big portion of the population. And then Biden, same thing. And so like, it's interesting because there's so much attention put in, and usually rightfully so in terms of who's the president, who's the leader of a country, whatever. But when you look at it from the perspective of like, I wanted person A to win, but person B won, I think that you can find some safety in the fact that like we do have checks and balances. We do have all these systems in place where like the president's powerful, but they're not unilaterally powerful to the point where like you have to worry about like we're a developed nation in 4 years we're going to be, you know, completely wrecked and like everything has blown up.
This is really interesting. So
do you disagree?
I agree in a lot of ways.
Okay.
In that, yes, the amount of damage that a president can do in 4 years, there are limits to it. There are 100% limits to it. In a lot of ways, it is true that if you were living in wherever for the last 6 years and not paying attention to the news, things might be identical for you today as they were when Obama left office and Trump first came in, right? Roughly 6 years. I do think that that's true. But I also think we shouldn't understate the sort of, you know, on a cruise ship, which I have never gone on and I'm not interested, seems like a nightmare. I don't, you know.
After 2020, I'm out on that.
But on a cruise ship, you might say, you know, I'm looking at the captain. They're spending a lot of time watching TV. They're on the phone. They're in their office. They're sitting. They don't really seem to be like controlling the ship very much, but they are putting in place a system and a policy. Their attitude and the atmosphere that they create, it's sort of like a CEO of a company. You could kind of make the same analogy. This is not like the most important thing, but as an example, Trump coalesced and made feel more okay saying the stuff they already thought. A lot of white nationalists and white supremacists and people who don't like me because I'm Jewish, right? The number of anti-Semitic messages that I would get during the Trump era was higher than at any time before. Is that a policy change? No. Did Trump create anti-Semitism? Of course not. But there was a very clear change in that Trump rolled into his coalition and said, listen, I don't care about you hate Jews, you like Jews, whatever. I'm here for ABC reason, and you can be out there and they're not going to censor you and whatever. So it had a kind of trickle down impact and something tangible that like affected my day to day. So I agree with you in one sense, I also don't want to understate the kind of environment that is fostered by the person who is in the White House and the way it impacts state level government, conversations we have with each other, all these different sorts of things.
Yeah. What it immediately makes me think of, and I haven't thought super deeply about this, but around a lot of like the police reform, right? There's kind of like a couple of components. So obviously there was a number of situations that occurred across the country. People were very upset about it. Some cases, it seems like they were dead on, and like the story that came out first was exactly what happened, and actually pretty impressive in terms of how accurate the stories were. In other cases, it was like, well, they said this, but like more facts came out later, and like that is not what happened or whatever, right? And so we've had like this very kind of I don't know, I'm gonna say like an evolution, I think, in terms of people's reaction. So you go from some of those events initially happening, even before 2020 or whatever, right?
Yeah.
They occur. Then I remember like there was one night in I think 2020 during a lot of the social justice stuff and everything, like there's a police station that was set on fire. And I remember
Where
like,
was that?
Whoa, that's crazy. I think it was in like Wisconsin or Michigan or something, right?
Yeah, I vaguely remember that.
But like it was a situation where you were just like, it was kind of like a shock, like holy shit. In New York City, there was situations that were incredibly peaceful, and like you're like, seems like those people got a point of view, and like that's the American right to get out there and protest whatever.
Yeah.
And then I remember there was one night when they were looting, kind of some of the crowds were looting in Times Square, and we lived somewhat close. I was like, we're not gonna go outside tonight, right? And again, like I think a lot of people jump to the conclusion of like the looting crowd is the same crowd that was like marching
Holding
in protest
signs
on Saturday,
Yeah.
right? And like I don't know, like maybe not, like who knows?
Yeah.
But like there was all these like conclusions and assumptions, like all this stuff, whatever. But then if you fast forward to even in the last 6 months or so, there have been a number of different situations who don't pay attention really to the news can think off the top of my head where there was the guys, I think it was in Alabama, who shot and killed the guy who was like running in the neighborhood or whatever.
Oh, yeah. They've already been sentenced, the father, son, and the driver.
So that wasn't the police
Georgia,
doing it.
I think.
Georgia or wherever it was. It's somewhere in the South, right?
Yes.
That was like a pretty controversial thing. And the police weren't involved in the incident, but then there became like who's friends with who. And like there was a bunch of like controversy, it seemed.
Yeah.
We are recording this now about a week after the gentleman who I think it was in Chicago or Memphis, maybe it was, who was just beat by the 5 police officers.
Yeah.
And it's on video, right? Doesn't look so great. And so as you kind of unpack all this stuff, race gets thrown into it all the time. And what I think that I've started to kind of unpack a little bit more is like, there are definitely situations where race plays a huge piece in it. And like, that's not good. We should call that out and kind of treat it as, I think America as a society generally says like racism is bad. We don't want that. And we want to live our lives without that as a piece of it. But then there's a lot of other components of like just poverty, right? Where you see some of these situations happen and you're like, dude, white, black, brown, anything. That is a outcome that is driven by poverty. And how do we solve the poverty problem? So like when you zoom out on all this stuff, you're like, hold on a second. We have police, we have economics, we have like all these different things that a government normally has to deal with.
Yeah.
And you're like, are there right answers? Because if you just focus on the race issue, right, across all these different topics, like you're going to come out with maybe some solutions, maybe not, depends on how good you are. But then if you focus on the poverty issue exclusively, then like you solve those problems, but you don't solve the race issue. Then you go and you solve like the education problems. And like you very quickly realize you can't look at any of these in a silo because you have to try to actually solve and create a better society.
Yes.
How do you do that? Hey guys, I hope that you're enjoying this conversation. As you probably realize, we don't run any ads on this show. That's right. All the other podcasts, all the other YouTube shows that you watch, they have advertisers. We don't have any direct relationships with advertisers, and we simply create this because we enjoy doing it. Now that we do that though, we have a team. And if you'd like to support us, one way you can do that is to go subscribe to the Pomp letter. It's a daily letter that I write to about 235,000 people about my personal opinion on financial markets, business, technology, and Bitcoin. Just go to pompletter.com and you can sign up there. I'd love to have you join us, and it's a great, easy way to support the work that the team and I are doing on a daily basis. All right, let's get back into this conversation.
Well, the first realization is what you're saying, which is you can't look at these as siloed issues. I think one of the classic ones that represents this is in some of these incidents, firearms are like at the nexus of what took place. And so the conversation about firearms comes up. And there are some who say the only aspect to the entire firearm thing is mental health. You say, well, is that really likely? As complicated as the world is with, as you say, poverty, education, firearms law, Constitution, Second Amendment, mental illness, but we're just going to say mental illness is the way to solve this. And by the way, some of the folks who say mental illness is the way to solve this don't actually want to fund better access to mental health services. So like the realization you came to, which is you can't silo these issues, is a absolutely perfect and fundamental one. I think that in some cases, these incidents are less about race and more about something else. I think in some cases they're completely about race. I mean, I think I was speaking recently to a friend of mine who's a blonde white woman after one of the incidents you mentioned, where she said, I know when I'm out in the world, that will just never happen to me because of my identity. It just will never happen. Even if I have a gun in the car and I say to the officer, I have a gun, I'm never getting pulled out and beaten to death. You could add on to that, solely because of my identity. And that's of course true. That's never going to happen to her. So we know intuitively that with some of these things, it is very much related to race. In other ways, it also is,
race, and in that case, could be gender, could
be race and gender.
There's like, I also always, I had a friend in college. I played college football, and so you can imagine there's people from all walks of life, right? White, black, brown, the whole thing, and from different geographies inside the United States, and also some people who'd come from outside the United States. And like you kind of put all this. And I remember some guy said it was an offhand comment. He was like walking out of the locker room once, and it's just always stuck with me. He was like, America's one of the only places where y'all talk about people with a single label as to describe the person. So it's a white guy, right? Or it's a black guy or whatever. And he was like, basically making the point of like, no, that person is race, gender, like you go to line, they're made up of all these different things. And so in these scenarios as humans, we underwrite a lot of that stuff, right? You could take two people of the same race, but different genders, and they may get treated differently. You could take two people of the same gender, but different race, and so it just gets so complicated so quickly that it's very hard to jump from current event to current event to current event to current event, trying to identify what is happening.
Yeah. And I think that one of the difficulties is sometimes the conversation that needs to be had is only useful if people really are open to considering all of the different types of solutions. And sometimes people are closed off too early. I mean, with the firearm thing, I've I've gathered, these weren't my original ideas, I've gathered 10 to 12 different points that I think would be useful in reducing gun violence.
What are they?
And well,
just generally.
So certain firearms should be unavailable to people under 25. If you are under 25, to get a gun at all, there should be a mandatory waiting period, required insurance, and you should have to get 2 letters from adults in your community saying they have no concerns with you doing that. There should be a psych eval. It should be sort of like with vision tests that are required every once in a while for driving. You should have to be relicensed for firearms as well. You know, this long list of things. But also, we should deal with the mental health thing. And it is also true that it's not just that it's really common that certain weapons are used in mass shootings. It's also really common that the perpetrators are of a certain profile, which is often young white men with certain characteristics that are less than ideal in their lives that are taking place. All of these things should be looked at. It gets extraordinarily political. So there will be people who hear that and they'll say, the mental health piece sounds great. All that gun stuff we don't really need to deal with, and then we're not going to get anywhere.
Mm-hmm. There seems to be both in America and I think some places in Europe as well, right? And maybe it's the media is just amplifying it. I don't have the data, so I need to caveat it with that. But guns, there's always shootings, right? I mean, they're being reported, stabbings, but then also like vehicles. People are just like getting run over. Right? There's a Christmas Day parade. There was in New York City, I think there was somebody who went over a sidewalk. There's somebody who I actually think, if I remember the details correctly, he like rented a commercial like construction truck, like a flatbed, and he like went down the bike path and like hit people. And I don't remember if he killed anybody or hurt them or what, but just like, okay, hold on a second. Like people are using vehicles, they're using guns, they're using all this kind of stuff. And it always makes me think of like, well, what is the counter examples, right? And We just saw one in California where a young guy was, I think, at a dance hall or something. Somebody walked in with a gun. I think he had been somewhere else and like shot some people. Unfortunately, had killed some of those individuals. Shows up, and this guy somehow wrestled the gun out of his hand.
Yeah.
Right. I remember watching an interview with a gentleman. I want to say it was somewhere in the Midwest or maybe in Southern California or something. He was at, I think it was a drag show. And his daughter's like friend was in the drag show. So his daughter was going down. It was him, his wife, his daughter, maybe like his daughter's boyfriend or something. But they were going to like support kind of a family friend. And military veteran, all of a sudden somebody busts in, they start shooting. He like drops to the ground, grabs his kid, he gets up. And the way he tells the story is he like pretty much ran up behind the guy while he's shooting, grabs him, puts him on the ground and just beats the fuck out of him. Right. And you're like, okay, that guy didn't have a gun. The first guy didn't have a gun. But then there was a situation in Indiana at a mall where a guy went into the bathroom, had a gun with him, gets it, comes out, starts shooting. And I guess the story is that he's like a 18 to 22-year-old kid who had to have some sort of training in the food hall, basically stands up and shoots like a pretty, far shot, shoots this guy and basically neutralizes the threat. And I think that maybe he had already shot one or two people, but like this guy was able to kind of stop the situation.
Yeah.
And so you look at it and you're like, man, I hear the argument of like, if everyone had guns, no one would shoot anybody. Maybe, right? I hear the argument of like, if nobody had guns, then there'd be less gun violence. But you start to realize like every single one of these situations is different. And actually you as an individual, you should pay attention to details. You should try to participate in the democratic process and politics and all that stuff. But like kind of at the end of the day, like, yo, you got to be prepared by yourself, right? Like when you live through your life, I don't want myself, my family, my kid to like worry about, they go to the mall and they're like, well, I better be prepared in case there's a shooting today. But at the same time, like, I do think that there's this element of like, unfortunately, we live in a world where like you can't control other people 100% of the time. There are criminals, there are people who do all these bad things. Like, you probably should just like pay a little bit of attention to like, how would you react in these situations, have somewhat of a plan, right?
What's so difficult about this is that there's what is the best societal ways to improve these things. And then given that this is where we are, what are the best things I can do?
Yes,
right?
that's a great way to frame it.
I, as an individual, don't want only what we would call the right-wing gun nuts to have the guns. That's scary to me. I don't really talk publicly about like my personal gun ownership, but just big picture, like the idea that only the right-wingers have the guns, that's a scary idea to me.
Do you think that's true?
It's not literally true. I mean, I have lots of liberal friends who are gun owners. They all support.
You're saying the like marketing of the gun debate is very much like the right wingers have the guns, even if the data actually is different.
Yes. Yeah. And if you say to me, well, all the people who think that it should be harder to get a gun don't have them, that's scary also, right? Because then you're sort of like ceding the gun ownership to the people you're most concerned about having them. So that's me at the personal level. At the societal level, it would be a much better thing where like when I go to Europe and I'm walking around, Dijon, France or whatever, I know nobody who's around has any guns. And obviously someone can get a gun. Sometimes there's a shooting in France, but statistically these things are so rare in just about every place in the world, other than places that are almost in sort of like war states than the United States. There is something that brings a certain level of peace where I'm like, nobody around here has firearms. And like, I don't have to worry about having one myself. So that is separate from me saying, given that the U.S. is the way it is, how prepared do I need to be? Do I need a bomb-proof car, or what exactly is it that I need? And they're two kind of different considerations, like you're talking about.
Do we have any data, or have you ever looked at like road rage incidences in other countries versus America? And
No.
What I think about is like almost using that as a proxy, maybe to like the aggressiveness of the American culture versus other places, right? So like when I think of Dijon, France, I think everyone's like chill. They're drinking like cappuccinos.
It's very chill. You can get any kind of mustard you want, and it's really great.
Lots of mustard everywhere. Some people are bathing in it, right? Like again, incredible generalization. Somebody from Dijon, France will watch this and
They'll
email
be like,
us.
I walk around with a gun.
Yes, of course, right? But like, I think that is the at least perception.
Yes.
If you go to like something like a London, I think that people would be like, oh, Dijon, France and London are still, they're on different parts of that scale.
Yeah.
But America, I think generally is seen as like on the more aggressive forward, kind of like, I'm going to go out there, I'm going to earn this, I'm going to like whatever.
Yeah.
And does that play into the debate too? Because now that's not mental health. That's also not
That's
a
culture.
weaponry. It's a cultural
this
thing,
is
right?
a critical difference because often Switzerland is pointed to, and Switzerland has a really high gun ownership rate, but Switzerland doesn't have a shooting problem. And it is not seen as a way to solve problems to use your gun in Switzerland. It's just not seen that way culturally. So like there is something in the United States where you see a road rage incident and someone feels justified in taking out a gun, sometimes actually, even discharging the firearm. That is a cultural thing to some degree. I don't think it's mental illness per se, but it's the idea that guns can be a solution to problems. And even with the mass shooters, in a certain sense, they see the mass shooting as the way to solve whatever problem it is they believe they have, which maybe they have or maybe they don't. I think that is an absolute difference, and I don't know how you change that.
Yeah. One of my wishes for society, if I can be arrogant enough to have a wish for all of us, is there's been some pretty heroic situations over the last couple of years that I wish didn't just get as much media attention, but got it for a more prolonged period. So I'll give you kind of three examples I could think of off the top of my head. So one is the Indiana counter shooter, I guess. Like, the guy who basically stopped the shooter with his own personal firearm. Again, should they have guns? Should they not have guns? And like all the details, whatever. But just like that takes some degree of courage to stand up, put yourself in harm's way, and discharge a weapon and try to stop someone. Related to that in a similar sense is, I think it was a Border Patrol agent at this school in Texas. There was an active shooter. I guess they were just waiting in the hallway or whatever. He shows up and he basically was like, I'm going in there. You guys want to come with me? Like, knock yourselves out. And I saw a photo later online, which again, who knows if it was real or not, but I guess the shooter had returned fire and had basically kind of skimmed his head or his hat or whatever. And so you look at that and you're like, dude, like, again, this guy is a law enforcement, officer to Border Patrol, whatever. Like, it's kind of his job. But at the same time, like, there's a bunch of other men and women that are standing that aren't doing it. And so, like, that guy probably should put him on a pedestal and say, like, hey, if you were put in this situation, like, we need more people like that who are willing to go put themselves in harm's way to stop it. But then also, even not in gun situations. I don't know if you know, in Indiana, Jordy's from Indiana, so I always give him shit that, like, there's a lot of weird stuff going on in Indiana sometimes. But there was a pizza delivery driver. He was driving down the road, and he passed a house at, kind of early morning hours, I think. And he saw smoke and a potential flame. So he stopped and kind of backed up. He went to go check the house, and he realized the house was on fire. So he kicks in the back door. And when he kicks in the back door, there's flames everywhere. And there's a couple of kids at the top of the stairs, and they start to come down. So he's like, oh, shit. So he grabs the kids, and he's basically bringing them outside. Yeah. And he keeps asking them, is there anybody else inside? Is there anybody else inside? And they're like, yeah, our like sister's inside. So he's like, shit, there's another kid inside. So he didn't wait outside. He didn't do anything. He goes back inside. He somehow gets the kid, I think, and he gets lost. So now he's inside of a burning house. He's lost, doesn't know which way he's out. He basically sees a light, goes up to the second floor, kicks out a window, and jumps. And so there's body cam footage of this guy comes running around the house. He's got the kid. The cops are there, right? Whatever. And he hadn't kicked out the window. He had punched it out. And so he had sliced up his arm pretty bad. And so on the body cam footage, they basically take the kid from him and they lay him down and they start immediately addressing, his wounds. And all the guy keeps asking is the kid's okay? And you're like, man, we need more people like that.
Yeah.
Right? But those stories play for 24 or 48 hours.
Yeah.
Maybe a week we get out of it.
The other thing about it is that third story is amazing. There is no doubt that the counter shooters, whether they're in law enforcement or not, there is no doubt an amount of courage that is involved in that. Trump once said, I would run in. And it's like, no, you wouldn't, dude. You would, first of all, you don't run, but you would walk away. But I am more interested
You hate Trump, don't you?
Well, I just think he's a joke.
Yeah,
it's just, he can be the punchline to any joke. I think it would be more interesting to prevent those shootings from happening in the first place. That's a much harder thing. It's a much harder thing to think about because it's not, well, here's where it started. Here's where the shooting started. But where did this person's desire for a gun start? Where did the situation that this person ended up in start familially at some point I am more interested in that as a solution than depending on counter shooters.
Yeah, I think that's right. It goes back to your idea about like society versus individual,
Yeah.
right? Of like, as a society, we don't want shootings.
Right.
As an individual, are you going to be the person who is caught in the shooting and not prepared?
And what are you going to do? Exactly.
And what are you going to do?
100%.
Yeah. It's very unfortunate, and I think also about there's a school here in Miami that when I go running, I run by. And like, it's frankly sad. It looks like it's a lockdown location.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, they have a security guard that checks every car that goes in and out. They have all this stuff. And like in high school, I grew up in North Carolina, and like, I don't remember all of the details. Right. But like, I'm pretty sure, I know for sure kids would go hunting before school. I don't know if they would actually show up to school with like a shotgun or something like in the truck.
Yeah.
But there was never a worry that like, even if that was happening or they had gone hunting and went home and then like whatever,
Yes.
we never worried about like somebody's going to come to school and shoot everybody.
Right.
Right. And so like I was in middle school when Columbine happened. And that was, I think, the first time people were like, oh, this is like a thing.
Yeah.
But
That's
it
my
was-
first memory of that. Yeah. Same
Yeah.
thing.
And maybe there was ones before, but like, I think that was like for our entire generation,
Yeah.
like that was the first one. But like, even after that, I don't think people were like, oh, this is going to happen all the time.
Yeah.
Now it feels like you go read a news site, like, unfortunately, it seems like almost, every week there's something that's going on.
And the two sides to that are, it is happening a crazy amount in the United States. It also is still statistically very rare. So it's also important not to feel as though there's a 50-50 shot that when you walk out or when your kid's in school, there's going to be a shooting. It's not, that's not healthy either, And it's sort of like when people dramatically overestimate the risk of being in a terrorist attack. It's so unlikely. They really are very infrequent, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't work to prevent them. And I think that's an important thing with the shootings as well.
Yeah. You want to know one of the things that's helped me mentally? I didn't do it because of this, but like I've noticed I'm much less worried about a lot of this stuff. Reading physical books.
Oh yeah. I mean, have never had a Kindle. I always read physical books,
Yeah.
but do you mean the content of them or just physically reading them?
Because if I audited my calendar, right? So I get a report at the end of every week from someone on our team who basically says, this is how you spent the hours that you scheduled this week. And so different businesses, different things, whatever. And then I basically have a block every night and that is just for reading.
I do the same thing.
Now that reading block is recent, like in the last, I don't know, a couple months, right?
Yep.
Because before what I realized was I call like doom scrolling. I'd sit there and I'd be, I'm on Twitter. Okay, let me go check what's going on Instagram. Oh, maybe I post something on Twitter, right?
Yeah.
Oh, let me go back to Instagram. Like, and you're like doing this, and all of a sudden you realize like, I've been here for 45 minutes. This is crazy.
Yes.
So when I started to read the books, the physical books, what I noticed was I was spending less time on social media. So it was less about like the physical nature of the book.
Yeah.
And it was more of like, I'm not on social media reading about all this crazy stuff that's happening in the world that I think is so prevalent that it's literally happening outside my front door.
Right.
Instead, I am focused on other things or whatever. And I do wonder what the connection between this feeling like the world is ending, everything's horrible, like it's not going to get better, whether it's depression, anxiety, like all these different things, and just like literally using social media.
I think the connection is abundantly clear. I think there's a clear connection, and it's unfortunate because the desire to sort of like be informed about what's going on the planet and in your community and your country, natural and healthy to want to know what's going on so that you can decide, here are ways I can help, here are things I want to get involved in. But there's no doubt that spending more time consuming that type of content is not good. And I don't think the solution is, now these digital detoxes are very much in.
What are those?
You take 30 days and you're off social media. And then after the 30 days, you go back and do the exact same thing. And people say, during those 30 days, I experienced this or that, and it was great in this way.
Have you ever done one?
No, I haven't. And I don't plan to, because I don't think it's really practical. It's more practical to, I think, do what you're doing and what I try to do, which is, okay, I don't want to end up sucked into social media such that I don't go to the gym or I don't read a physical book. So I'm going to schedule in the things that are important. If I've done those things and then I spend 15 minutes looking at Instagram,
whatever,
fine, right? But I'm saying, well, here are the priorities rather than allowing this stuff that I don't really want to be doing to fill up most of my time. I think it's the same concept.
Yeah. The digital detox is interesting because it's kind of like habits, right?
Right.
So James Clear talks about like, if you say January 1st, I'm gonna start going to the gym, and you go for 2 hours,
Yeah.
it's unsustainable. There's no way
Completely
you're going to keep it.
unsustainable.
Instead, just go for 5 or 10 minutes and then just build the habit, right?
Yeah.
And then over time, it'll become more. Talk a little bit about your business in terms of like, how do you think about content creation? Where are you guys focused now? How important are like the cycles of the mainstream media in terms of election seasons versus not, given that you guys talk a lot about politics?
So the biggest downside to being in news and politics is that it's much more difficult to sort of like create news stories. And other than by like attacking someone who's in my space and trying to create some kind of a rivalry, which is not really my thing, it's very hard to create stuff. You know, chess right now is having a huge upswing, online chess. And one of the great things about it is they can create news by organizing tournaments, creating matchups where people might be late or people might be accused of cheating. You know, you can kind of like create a news cycle. And in news and politics, it's much harder to do that. So we definitely do have this ebb and flow that relates to elections.
Do you ever like see the news story and you're like, I got to lean into this and basically like all hands on deck? And,
yeah, absolutely. And it's not out of a sort of like predatory instinct, but it's sort of like, here's an opportunity to really connect with people who then might stick with me because they value sort of the thing I'm doing. My big thing is I want to be as efficient as possible in content creation. So I want to repurpose content in as many ways as possible. So now we have a full-time social media guy who is taking all the stuff that used to just be podcast and YouTube and thinking, okay, let's crop it vertically, subtitle it, and turn it into 5 TikToks. Let's use, you know, whatever other sort of tools we're using. So it's becoming as efficient as possible, getting better at identifying what are the stories my audience cares about. Sometimes I'm just wrong. Sometimes I think my audience will be really interested in a particular story and it's just a swing and a miss, and that's not the case. So being more accurate as far as that goes. And then 3, leveraging technology, because we get pitched all the time by platforms. We're going to be the next YouTube, or we're going to be better than YouTube, or here's a way to, instead of by ad revenue, with subscription revenue to bolster what you're doing. Or
what do you guys do now? So you record content and you put audio podcasts up on all the audio platforms. Where do you put the video content?
YouTube.
Okay.
And
do you put up anywhere else?
Facebook.
Okay.
TikTok. Instagram.
Yeah. So not Rumble or any of these other
you know,
kind of
it's funny you
platforms?
mention it. I think we're on Rumble. Rumble has this thing where you click a button and it'll just mirror your YouTube channel.
Oh, interesting.
And so I think we did that. We're not heavily invested in it, but I think we are on there. We don't get much traction. It might not come as a huge shock to you.
What is the biggest surprise on all the platforms for you over the last couple of years?
TikTok.
Yeah, same here.
The scale with which, you know, TikTok, rather than being kind of follower based, it's individual video based. So aside from the number of followers we have, individual videos can just hit. We had one where we sent a correspondent to a Trump rally in, I think it was Texas, 1.2 million TikTok views in like a week, because it was just perfect for the way we edited it. And the guy, Luke, who did it is really good at, you know, all these different things.
We ever, Tyler, we got 1 million views on TikTok on a video? Oh, we got 6 million views on it.
That's your highest one.
Yeah.
But by the way, it's probably, I'm not in it. It's probably the, what video is it? Oh, Liver King. I pressed them and
we could talk about Liver King.
I think he's a billionaire.
Is that true?
I mean, I was sitting there and I was interviewing him and I started doing the math, and he does $100 million in revenue. And
do we know that? I mean, he's lied about a lot of stuff. Do we know he's doing a?
Have you ever heard this theory of the alter ego?
No.
So my wife is the one who told me this. She'll be upset if I don't give her credit for it. But basically, the alter ego, a lot of these people have. So Kobe Bryant, Black Mamba. When he goes on the court, that's Black Mamba. That's not Kobe Bryant. So he separates kind of personal life from like what he does on the court. David Goggins' new book, he talks about David Goggins didn't accomplish this shit. Goggins did. And it's kind of this, he calls it like a mental lab, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that actually there's a number of people on the internet, like these creators, they have the same thing. So I don't actually think that Liver King, when the camera's on, is him.
Oh, of course it's not.
Right?
There's no way it is.
And so what ends up happening is the character's not on steroids, but he is on steroids.
Okay.
And so what ends up happening is it becomes the things that are coming out of their mouth have no anchoring in reality whatsoever. And like that one's a very obvious, like yes, no, whatever.
Yeah.
But like if you go and you watch all these people online, you're like, no, what that person is saying is what they want their character to be, or what they believe the character is.
That
it's
may
not
be.
actually them in person. Right. And so like what's fascinating is I wonder, and we didn't talk about this with him, but like I wonder that if his friend had asked him, are you on steroids? no cameras on, no anything, would he have just been like, yeah, of course?
Right.
Or would he have been like, no? And then like, that's more malicious, right? Because like, it's like you actually are lying all the time to people. But like outside of the steroid thing, like I actually was like pretty impressed with just how he was like, I lied. I was wrong. I deserve all this hate. Like, he just like took it on the chin.
I didn't see that clip, but that is interesting. I mean, part of it is even since that, TikTok just recommends his videos to me because it just does.
I'm sure he's popping on TikTok.
Yeah, absolutely. In one, I see him sitting there with blocks of salt and he says that's his dinner. Who would believe? I mean, it's just like, it's almost silly, right? Like, is it, what I don't understand is that obviously a joke, or does he say that and some people go, wow, Liver King's doing a fast where he's just licking salt blocks for a few days. What is that? I don't even
see.
Really
like that's a perfect example. I think that the expectation is people know.
And then after he goes and has ravioli off screen.
Or whatever. Or like he may be actually doing a fast, but he's not licking salt blocks.
Right.
Right? Like maybe what he's doing is he's just doing a water fast, which lots of other people do, some for religious reasons, some for health reasons, whatever. Yeah. But like, I kind of, when I saw the news about the steroids, my first reaction was like, wait, you guys actually, you guys actually thought he wasn't on steroids?
Yeah.
Right? And so I don't know. It was just like that one's like a very weird one.
Well, even like the organ stuff, where it was like in the emails it was revealed he has like a couple ounces of this stuff, but then like at dinner, his chef puts like pounds and pounds of this stuff. I'm kind of wondering like what happens with that stuff, or when he has like 12 steaks sitting in front of him.
Yeah.
Is anybody eating those steaks? Does he have 40 people at his house?
It's very hard to eat a lot of steak.
The dinner is 30 pounds of food. Obviously he's not eating it. What happens with the food? I don't know. I'm curious about that.
Yeah. All right. So Liver King, I guess, is he got 6 million views on TikTok, not me.
But TikTok is fascinating in the sense that it's a totally different audience for me.
But I think, so I agree with the different audience, but I think that if you had to choose, well, let me ask, and then I'll tell you what I would do. If you had to choose between the TikTok audience or YouTube Shorts audience, which one would you pick?
Well, that question changes today because TikTok or YouTube Shorts monetization starts today.
Do you think they're going to pay out a lot?
I don't know. I'd have to know the answer to that question. The thing that has been tough about TikTok is it doesn't monetize. And at some point when I have staff and expenses, I have to think about how am I slicing the time and what is the revenue that's generated from it. TikTok doesn't really monetize, and I don't know if it helps bring people into my other spaces. I'll get recognized. I was just here at a Walgreens, and a 65-year-old lady who worked there came up to me and said, I watch you on TikTok. That's super interesting. Talk to her a little bit more. She doesn't know I have a podcast, doesn't know I'm on YouTube. Yeah. Now, maybe that's my fault because I'm not telling my TikTok audience about these other platforms that I do monetize, but it seems a little siloed right now.
Yeah. What's interesting about it is I think I heard... maybe it was Mr. Beast. Somebody that has a large audience was talking about the fact that you could, or maybe actually it was Reed, who is Mr. Beast's manager. You could watch like 5 videos of somebody on TikTok and not know who they are. Mm-hmm. If you watch 5 YouTube videos, you know exactly who they are. Like there's a difference in the connectivity with the person.
Yeah,
and some of that might be the UI UX of like the site, but also there's something about like a 30-second video versus a 3 or 4 minute or 8 minute video.
I agree.
And so I think that I would pick YouTube over TikTok 10 out of 10 times, regardless of the monetization.
I think on average, like one of the things we talk about with my team is an audio podcast listener is on average more connected than a YouTube viewer, right?
Oh, interesting.
In the sense
podcast.
Because if somebody is subscribed to the podcast and it gets downloaded onto their phone, and while they're at the gym or whatever, they spend an hour listening to me, that is a much stronger connection on average than somebody who sees 1 4-minute video of mine on YouTube and then kind of moves on to other stuff. And we find that podcast listeners convert to paid memberships at a much higher rate. Now we have way fewer of them, right? Because we have 1.6 million YouTube subscribers. But on average, the podcast listener, I think, is more connected and more engaged than a YouTube subscriber. I think a YouTube subscriber is more engaged than a TikTok follower.
Yeah, that's interesting to think of. YouTube is easier to grow, right? Because of the virality and kind of the lack of need to opt in for the user to share, right? Just kind of YouTube sends it. But actually, that means that the podcast listeners more valuable and more connected.
I think so. I couldn't tell you by what degree, but by some degree for sure.
Yeah. How do you guys make money?
So most of these platforms have ad revenue on them. And then we have a membership program on our website. It's like a freemium model where you get the show commercial free, and we do like an extra members only show. And then we do direct ad sales as well.
And when people sign up for the paid membership, how much is it?
$6 a month or $60 for the year.
Well, that's not bad, right? And you use something you guys built, or use another service?
It's built on WordPress. Uses Stripe and PayPal for payments, and works pretty well. All these systems could always be better, but it's good.
And Stripe and PayPal, you've ever had problems with them, given all the news politics talk?
Never.
Yeah.
Never. No. I think the most annoying problem is people who forget that it's a subscription. They see the charge a year later, file a chargeback. We were talking about where does the burden fall?
Yeah.
We get hit with, not only do we sometimes lose the payment, but we get hit with a dispute fee because they are like, this was fraud, even though they just forgot. And that's a bummer. That can start to add up.
We on the Substack, I'd written it for years. I never checked one time any of this. I didn't know about disputes or anything.
Yeah.
And we hired someone. She goes in and looks. She's like, do you understand that people for years have been disputing all these charges? And I was like, no. What does that mean? And she explained it to me, and I was like, and we're paying on top of losing the revenue? And she's like, yeah. I was like, we should probably figure out this. And what you'd find is exactly that, right?
We have a small Substack, and Substack will fight it for you is one thing, but then you still get the opportunity to submit as well. And I don't actually know what you're supposed to do on that.
Yeah. So what's interesting is most people are not being malicious. I mean, you get an idiot every once in a while who's like read all the way up for 360 days and then they're trying to do something. Yeah. But for the most part, people are just, they forgot. Yeah. They didn't mean to, they wanted to do monthly, not yearly, whatever, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I still think the net, all of these all of these systems, we have issues with YouTube. We've been banned from TikTok for the similar stuff where it was like your content is spreading disinformation. Like, no, we're debunking the disinformation. We took a week to email everybody we could. Eventually, the channel reappeared on TikTok. We'd never heard from anybody. We don't know why. We have the chargeback issue. We have all these issues. But without these platforms, I would have no following, right? Yeah. So I think they're all such an obvious net positive, just a matter of managing them the right way.
If you had to pick one channel, what would you pick? That you only get to keep one?
Right now, it's mathematically, it's probably YouTube.
YouTube.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ben Thompson. I don't know if you know who that is. Stratechery. And also, I think James Clear and maybe Mark Manson too, like two authors. I've listened to podcasts with all three of them recently, and they all said email.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because they have the relationship.
Right. They have
a
much bigger list.
Yeah,
our email list is like 60K. And it doesn't get the high. I mean, what's interesting is each day we send out a newsletter with what's on that show. Of the 60K, we get 20,000 opens, which is really considered pretty high. Yeah. But it's not super useful for other stuff in my experience. So it's a way to keep people engaged with the content, but it's not directly doing that much for us.
They're there to see what's on the show today.
Yeah, which is great. It's a fine way to keep people engaged.
Interesting. What is your aspiration? Like, what are you trying to eventually build?
Exactly what I'm doing. Yeah, I mean, I used to think it would be great to get hired by whoever, but now that I know so many people that have been hired by whoever, and they have 4 bosses, and they have a set schedule, and it's at this point, I'm more than successful enough and into my career enough that I just aspire to keep doing what I'm doing and keep growing the platforms I'm on.
Did anyone ever talk to you about going to work at one of the networks?
Yes, in the sense of, hey, if you start appearing regularly, you might then become an unpaid contributor and eventually a paid contributor. And then maybe if someone is sick, you could be a guest host. And I was like, that's not sounding that great to me, really. Yeah. And I did have one conversation early in my career, and I've told this story before, with a radio sort of consultant executive who said, listen, there's really no market for what you're doing because you're on the left politically. How much do you care about, like, would you kind of like, because you're good enough, but you got to do like right-wing stuff. Would you claim to be on the right if it could get you a job? And I was like, no, I wouldn't do that. That sounds really horrible.
That sounds crazy that they even suggest that.
It sounds crazy. Yeah, he's like, because that's where the money is right now. We could get you syndicated on, you could be on in Milwaukee. And I was like, I don't know that I need to be on in Milwaukee right now. Let me do what I'm doing.
Yeah. I've talked to networks like very loosely before. Yeah. And, always within 5 minutes, it's like, this sounds horrendous. Like I have so much respect for the people who do it
100%.
because it's something I couldn't do. Like in the day to day of like, I am excited to go do this.
Yeah.
Right. And schedule is one piece of it, but also, there's an individual, my brother was telling me he recently had lunch with, who's like a sportscaster, and guy gets up at 2:30 in the morning.
Just it's a non-starter.
Like,
it's a non-starter. I once filled in on an 8 a.m. radio show.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, this is it. I know that I'm never doing this.
Yeah,
and
but
it's
8
just
a.m.
not
though, I got to be here at 6:45.
Yeah, right. Well,
Which means that
I was going
like,
backwards, and I'm like, let's see, when do I have to get up? It's way too early for me.
Yeah.
And you know, part of it is maybe I don't have the work ethic for that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe it's me where I should. But then now I go, I'm doing way better now than had I pursued that path. So I don't think it's really a work ethic issue. I think it's just knowing what you want and what you don't want to do.
Mm-hmm. It's awesome. Where can we send people to find you on the internet?
DavidPakman.com.
All right. And what's there when they get there?
The audio content, the video content, and all sorts of other stuff. Basically everything's there. My social media, all of it.
All right. I have 2 last questions for you.
Please.
I want you to say one bad thing that Biden's done, and I want you to say one good thing that Trump did.
Okay. Bad thing that Biden has done is he has not done significantly, not nearly anything on cannabis. I would like to see him do cannabis reform. And good thing that Trump did. Well, I mentioned the good thing. Yeah, I mean, you know, a couple little things.
You know, that's it?
Yeah, that's really all I can think of.
All right.
I mean, he provided 4 years of some of the best comedy that anybody could ever dream of. And also,
SNL, they loved it.
he put SNL out of business at the end because if you couldn't do it any crazier than he was doing it. Yeah.
All right, now reverse. One good thing about Biden and one bad thing about Trump.
I love the stuff that Biden is doing on electric car charging infrastructure. So that's a good thing Biden's doing, and then was another bad thing.
What's a bad thing about Trump?
Oh well, I did so many. I don't want to go back to that.
What do you think is the worst thing?
It's impossible to. I don't know. Here's the thing. Here's why I can't say. It'll take years to know the stuff he did. I think in a couple years, ask me, and then maybe we'll know.
All right. I appreciate you coming.
Thank you.
I always appreciate someone who can talk about both sides of it. Obviously, you have your bias and your leanings
Absolutely.
and all this stuff, but I think it's important to be able to positive and negatives on both sides.
Glad to be here.
DavidPakman.com. Thank you so much, and we'll definitely do it again in the future.
Pleasure.